The priest refused to bury the poor woman until she whispered something. Chapter 1. The winter of 1952 had been particularly harsh in the small town of Millbrook, Vermont, where the White Mountains cast long shadows over weathered clapboard houses and the single Catholic church that stood like a sentinel at the town's heart. Father Ignatius McCarthy, a man of 53 years, with silver threading through his once black hair, stood at the frost-covered window of the rectory, watching the snow fall in thick, relentless sheets. His fingers wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold, but he didn't notice. His mind was elsewhere, wrestling with the request that had come to him that morning. Margaret Sullivan was dying. The woman who lived in the ramshackle cottage at the edge of town, the one the respectable folks crossed the street to avoid, the one who took in washing and mending to scrape together enough coins to survive, the woman who never set foot in his church, who lived without husband or family, who bore the weight of whispered rumors and pointed fingers. She had sent word through young Timothy O'Brien, the grocer's boy, asking for last rites. Father Ignatius had refused immediately, his response sharp and final. The church had rules, standards that must be upheld. Those who lived outside God's grace in life could not expect it in death. But now, as the afternoon light faded into a grey twilight, something gnawed at him. Perhaps it was the boy's face when he delivered the refusal back to Margaret's cottage. Or perhaps it was the unusual persistence of Mrs. Henley, his housekeeper, who had dared to question his decision over lunch. "Even Christ sat with sinners, Father," she had said quietly before retreating to the kitchen. The words echoed in the silence of his study, mixing with the whistle of wind through the gaps in the old window frames. Father Ignatius set down his cup with more force than necessary, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He reached for his coat, heavy wool that had seen 20 New England winters, and wrapped his scarf tight around his throat. If he was going, it would be for form's sake only, to show that he had done his duty as a priest, nothing more. The walk to Margaret's cottage took him down Main Street, past the hardware store where Mr. Peterson was closing up shop, past the diner where warm light spilled onto the snow-covered sidewalk. A few parishioners nodded to him, but he barely acknowledged them, his mind fixed on the unpleasant task ahead. The cottage sat apart from the town proper, down a narrow path that the town rarely bothered to plough. Father Ignatius picked his way carefully through the knee-deep snow, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The house itself seemed to lean against the wind, its paint peeling, one shutter hanging at an angle. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and uncertain. He knocked once, firmly, and pushed open the door without waiting for an answer. The interior was sparse but clean, surprisingly so. A single room served as kitchen and living space, with a doorway leading to what must be the bedroom. The smell of sickness hung in the air, mixed with something else. Lavender, perhaps, an attempt to mask the inevitable. Young Timothy appeared from the bedroom, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and fear at seeing the priest. "She's in here, Father," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something fragile. Father Ignatius followed him into the small bedroom, where Margaret Sullivan lay on an iron bed, covered with a quilt that had seen better days, but was meticulously patched. Her face was gaunt, her breathing shallow, but her eyes, when they opened, were clear and focused. She looked at him without surprise, as if she had known he would come, despite his refusal. The silence stretched between them, until finally, with visible effort, she gestured for him to come closer. Chapter 2. Father Ignatius approached the bed with reluctance, each step measured and heavy. The floorboards creaked under his weight, the only sound besides Margaret's labored breathing and the wind rattling the windows. He pulled a wooden chair close to the bedside, its legs scraping against the worn floor, and sat down stiffly, maintaining a careful distance. His hands remained folded in his lap, his rosary beads wound between his fingers, more out of habit than devotion in this moment. Margaret's eyes followed his movements, patient and knowing, as if she could see through the armor of righteousness he wore like a second cassock. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible, like dry leaves rustling. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction, just a simple acknowledgement of fact. Father Ignatius nodded curtly, his jaw tight. He would not offer comfort where he felt none was deserved, but duty demanded he at least hear her final words. "Speak, then," he said, his tone formal and cold. "If you have something to confess." Margaret's lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, more an expression of profound sadness mixed with something else he couldn't identify. She struggled to lift her hand, pointing to a glass of water on the nightstand. Timothy quickly helped her take a sip, supporting her head with surprising gentleness for a boy of 14. The pause stretched on, and Father Ignatius found himself studying the room despite himself. It was painfully bare, but immaculately clean. A single photograph sat on the dresser, too far away to make out clearly in the dim light of the oil lamp. No crucifix on the walls, no Bible on the nightstand, just the sparse furnishings of a life lived on the margins. Yet there was something about the space that felt carefully tended, loved even in its simplicity. His attention was drawn back to Margaret as she began to speak again, her words coming in short bursts between labored breaths. "I need to tell you something," she managed, each word seeming to cost her greatly. Not a confession, a truth. Father Ignatius leaned back slightly, his expression skeptical. What truth could this woman possibly have that would matter to him? He had come here out of duty, nothing more, and he would not pretend otherwise. "Then speak plainly," he said, checking his pocket watch pointedly. "The evening service begins soon." Margaret's eyes flickered with something that might have been hurt, but she continued, gathering what strength remained to her. "December 15th, 1929, she whispered, and Father Ignatius felt his blood turn to ice. The date hit him like a physical blow, though he struggled to keep his expression neutral. That date was burned into his memory, a scar on his conscience. The 23 years had not healed. The night of the blizzard, the night of his greatest shame, the night he had tried to bury so deep that sometimes he could almost pretend it had been a dream. Margaret's eyes never left his face as she continued. "The old McKenna barn, on the mountain road." His hands clenched involuntarily, the rosary beads cutting into his palms. No one knew about that night. No one could know. He had been young then, newly ordained, full of pride and certainty. The woman, Sarah, had come to him in desperation, and in his weakness, his humanity had overcome his vows. When she had returned months later with the consequence of that single night of failure, he had panicked. The baby, born too early in the midst of the worst blizzard in decades, had seemed like God's own judgment. He had left them at the abandoned barn, promising to return with help, but the storm had worsened, and by morning, when he had finally made it back, they were gone. No trace except for disturbed snow that the continuing blizzard soon covered. "How do you know about that?" he demanded, his voice hoarse, abandoning all pretense of composure. Margaret gestured weakly to Timothy, who helped her sit up slightly, propping pillows behind her back. The effort left her gasping, but her eyes remained fixed on Father Ignatius with an intensity that made him want to flee. "Because," she said, each word deliberate despite her weakness, "I was there, that night. I found them, found her dying, found the baby." Chapter 3. The room seemed to spin around Father Ignatius as Margaret's words sank in. His carefully constructed world, built on 23 years of penance and denial, crumbled with each labored breath she took. Timothy stood frozen by the bedside, clearly sensing the gravity of the moment, though not understanding its full import. Margaret raised her hand slightly, dismissing the boy with a gentle gesture. "Go home, Timothy. Your mother will worry." The boy hesitated, looking between the dying woman and the priest, whose face had gone pale as parchment, but eventually he grabbed his coat and slipped out, leaving them alone with the weight of the past. "I was walking that night," Margaret continued, her voice stronger now, as if the truth itself was lending her strength. "Running, really, from my husband, ex-husband by then. He'd found me at my sister's house in Rutland, drunk and violent as always. I fled into the storm, thinking it better to freeze than face his fists again. I knew about the old barn, had hidden there before." She paused, coughing weakly, and Father Ignatius found himself leaning forward despite himself, hanging on every word. "I heard her screaming before I saw the light from your lantern. Watched you leave, promising to return. But I knew that look, Father. The look of a man who runs and doesn't look back." The accusation in her words was sharp, but not cruel, simply factual. Father Ignatius wanted to protest, to explain about the storm, the impossibility of finding help in time, but the words died in his throat, because she was right. He had run, not just from the barn, but from the responsibility, from the consequence of his weakness. He had convinced himself they had found shelter elsewhere, had survived somehow, even as he knew in his heart it was a lie he told himself to sleep at night. "Sarah was dying when you left," Margaret continued, "lost too much blood. But she lived long enough to beg me to save the baby, a little girl, tiny but strong, crying with healthy lungs despite coming too early. A girl," Father Ignatius whispered, the words barely audible. "A daughter. He had a daughter." The reality of it crashed over him like a wave, drowning him in possibility and regret. All these years he had imagined the child dead, had prayed for forgiveness for a life lost. But she had lived. "Where is she?" he asked urgently, grabbing Margaret's hand without thinking. "What happened to her?" Margaret's eyes softened slightly at his desperation, the first hint of compassion she had shown him. "I raised her," she said simply. "Told everyone I had gone away to have a baby in secret. Let them think what they wanted about me, call me what they would. Better they judge me than hunt for her real father. She needed protection, stability, not scandal." The sacrifice of it staggered him. This woman, whom he had dismissed as worthless, had destroyed her own reputation to protect his child, their child. "Her name is Elizabeth Sullivan. She lives in Boston now, married to a good man, a teacher. They have 2 children of their own." Margaret reached shakily for the photograph on the dresser, and Father Ignatius stood to retrieve it for her. The picture showed a young woman with dark hair and eyes that he recognized with a start as his mother's eyes, standing beside a tall man in a suit, 2 small children in front of them. They were smiling, radiantly happy, the kind of family photograph that graced mantels in respectable homes everywhere. His granddaughter and grandson stared back at him, strangers who carried his blood. "She thinks I'm her mother," Margaret whispered. "And I let her believe it. It was easier than the truth. But she deserves to know where she came from, deserves to know she was born of love, however brief and forbidden." Father Ignatius felt tears on his face, hot and sudden. He hadn't cried since his mother's funeral 30 years ago, but now he couldn't stop. The weight of 23 years of guilt and self-recrimination crashed down on him, but alongside it came something else, something he hadn't expected: gratitude. Profound, overwhelming gratitude to this dying woman who had been more of a shepherd than he had ever been. "Why?" he asked, his voice broken. "Why did you do it? Why sacrifice everything for a stranger's child?" Margaret's smile was peaceful now, as if in the telling she had found her own absolution. "Because someone had to, because she was innocent, because in that barn, in that storm, I found my purpose. I'd been running from my life, but she gave me a reason to stop running, to build something new." She squeezed his hand weakly. "I'm not asking for your gratitude, Father. I'm asking for your blessing. Not for me, but for her. Let me die knowing Elizabeth came from something blessed, not cursed." Chapter 4. Father Ignatius knelt beside the bed, his knees hitting the hard floor with a sound that echoed in the small room. He took Margaret's hands in both of his, feeling how small and cold they were, how much life had already fled from them. The proud priest who had entered this cottage was gone, replaced by a broken man facing the truth of his failures and the magnitude of another's sacrifice. "Forgive me," he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep within. "God, forgive me for what I've done, for what I failed to do." Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around his, the pressure barely perceptible, but profoundly comforting. "There's nothing to forgive," she said softly. "We were all young once, all human. You made a choice in fear. I made one in love. Both led us here." She paused, her breathing increasingly labored. "But there is something you can do. Elizabeth doesn't know about you, but she knows I'm dying. She's coming tomorrow morning, driving up from Boston with her family. You could meet her, not as her father, but as my priest. Give her comfort. Let her see that her mother, the only mother she's known, dies with the church's blessing." The irony of it was not lost on him. He who had refused to bury Margaret would now play the part of her spiritual comfort for the daughter he never knew he had. But it was a small price to pay, a tiny penance for a lifetime of absence. "I'll do more than that," he said firmly, his voice regaining some of its strength. "You'll have the funeral you deserve, Margaret Sullivan. The whole town will know that a saint walked among them unrecognized." Margaret shook her head weakly, but he continued. "No arguments. You saved my daughter, gave her a life, a chance at happiness. You took my shame and wore it as your own. If that's not sainthood, I don't know what is." Through the window, the snow had stopped falling, and the moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting silver light across the worn floorboards. Father Ignatius began to pray, not the formal last rites he had originally refused, but something more personal, more true. He prayed for Margaret's soul, for Elizabeth's happiness, for the grandchildren he would never truly know. He prayed for Sarah, 23 years too late, and for himself, for the courage to live with the truth Margaret had given him. As he prayed, he felt Margaret's hand relax in his, her breathing becoming shallower but more peaceful. "Tell me about her," he said quietly. "Tell me about Elizabeth as a child." And Margaret, with her remaining strength, painted pictures with words. A little girl who loved to read, who climbed trees despite scraped knees, who sang in the school choir with a voice like an angel. She told him about first days of school and last days of summer, about teenage rebellions and young love, about the wedding where Margaret had walked her down the aisle because there was no father to do so. Each memory was a gift, a piece of the life he had missed, and Father Ignatius treasured them all, storing them carefully in his heart. As dawn approached, painting the sky pink and gold through the frosted windows, Margaret's breathing grew quieter. Father Ignatius had moved from the floor to sit on the edge of the bed, still holding her hand, maintaining the vigil he should have kept 23 years ago. "She has your stubbornness," Margaret whispered with the ghost of a smile. "And Sarah's kindness. She's a teacher, like her husband. She helps children who struggle, who don't fit in. She says every child deserves a chance." The pride in her voice was unmistakable, a mother's pride, earned through years of sacrifice and love. "Thank you," Father Ignatius said, the words inadequate but all he had. "Thank you for being the parent I couldn't be, for loving her when I didn't even know she existed." Margaret's eyes, which had been growing distant, focused on him one last time. "Love her now," she said clearly. "In whatever way you can, love her now." And with those words, as the first rays of sunlight touched her face, Margaret Sullivan died, a saint in the eyes of the one man who had most misjudged her. Father Ignatius closed her eyes gently and stood, his legs stiff from the long vigil. Through the window, he could see a car approaching down the snowy lane, a blue sedan with Massachusetts plates. Elizabeth had come home. He straightened his cassock, wiped his face, and prepared to meet his daughter for the first and likely last time. He would honor Margaret's wishes, would be simply the priest who had comforted her mother in her final hours. But he would also ensure that Margaret Sullivan received the funeral of a saint, that the whole town would know the truth of her character, if not her secrets. And in his heart, for the rest of his days, he would carry the knowledge that grace sometimes comes from the most unexpected places, and that the woman he had deemed unworthy of burial had been all along the guardian angel of his greatest shame and his greatest blessing.